Hello, AV World. Last time we talked about Western Africa and to a certain extent North Africa. We talked about the Empire of Ghana, the Malian Empire, the Songhai Empire, and the Hausa kingdoms or the Hausa Confederacy. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and basically talk about most of everything else. This would include Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa. The Africa that we've talked about has so far been pretty connected to Dar al-Islam. We talked about the importance of trade routes that run from North Africa all the way down to Western Africa. We're going to shift and basically talk about the parts of Africa that are less connected to Dar al-Islam. There's going to be an exception or two, but in general, these are parts of Africa that are more isolated and less Islamic than what you see in Western and North Africa. We're actually going to start off with one pretty significant exception, which is the Swahili coast. The Swahili coast, and really what sets it apart from the other areas of Africa we're going to talk about is that it's defined actually by its connections to Dar al-Islam. So the Swahili are basically like an ethno-linguistic group. So they're not a nation state, they're not a country, they are a group of people that share a common language. And the Swahili language itself is actually created because of the combination of Bantu and Arabic. So this is an example of syncretism, or which is of course a type of cultural diffusion. Syncretism is where you see the merging of different cultures. So as some review, it's probably a good idea to pause the video right here and ask yourself why this area would be an exception. Why is this area going to be connected to Dar al-Islam? Pause the video now and try to come up with an answer. If your answer is because of Indian Ocean trade, you would definitely be correct. So you have the emergence of the Swahili city-states along what is now modern-day Sudan, Kenya, etc. And each city-state was independent with its own sort of king, but of course you have trade that comes in from basically Dar al-Islam. Now, you have a trade that's based on goods that Arabic traders really can't get elsewhere. This would include things like iron, timber, which is especially valuable considering that much of the Middle East is not really heavily forested, animal hides, seashells, and as we'll talk about in a little bit, gold as well. Also, by the time of the 13th century, there were Chinese goods that were arriving along the Swahili coast. This would include porcelains and silks and that kind of thing. And I think eventually, as we'll talk about, the Chinese actually get to this part of Africa an exact tribute from, a significant chunk of the Swahili coast. Now, because these were mercantile city-states and they were sort of dependent upon overseas trade, as you can kind of imagine, there is a very stark income gap or wealth gap between the merchants that are sort of near the top of the pyramid and basically the commoners that are down at the bottom. Now, where did the Swahili come from in the first place? Well, they originally came from actually Nigeria. They originated as part of a series of Bantu migrations that start as early as 1000 BCE and range all the way to 1000 CE. Now, one thing that's actually pretty true of this part of Africa even today is that it's pretty crowded, especially along areas like the Niger River. As the population of mostly these city-states and empires increase, there's a need for more and more land that's right for agriculture. If you remember, because of the fact that you have lots of desert in the north, it's not as if there's a ton of opportunities for migration there. Also, by the time you have the spread of Islam, the north is also very, very centralized and very, very powerful. So really, the only alternative is to slowly but surely spread towards I can do cardinal directions, I think. Drivers up with me with fun. East and south. So that's a 2,000 year process. And of course, once the Bantu people migrate to the Swahili coast, they then come into contact with Arabic traders, and the rest, as they say, is history. So here are some, I'm not sure that I like the fact that the slide has positive versus negative results because, like, as history people, I'm not sure that we can assign those kinds of value judgments, but um, we do have the spread of very sophisticated metallurgical knowledge. And of course, that sort of makes sense because this area of Africa was all about the gold. And so you have knowledge about, uh, creating gold jewelry, ironworking, that kind of thing. And that's going to be significant here in just a second. You see the spread of new types of crops, bananas and yams, and you begin to see the emergence of powerful centralized states as opposed to mostly stateless societies. Now, negative result, again, I don't like that necessarily, but when you have the expansion of civilizations that have powerful states into areas that are mostly stateless, is not going to usually work out well for stateless people. This is a very simplistic analogy, but think about the net effect of the Columbian Exchange once Europeans arrive in the New World and the experiences of Native Americans. I mean, Native American culture kind of still exists today, but it is in a much more sort of reduced form because, for the most part, Native Americans are forced to assimilate, and Native Americans die out in large numbers. Versus, let's say, their European conquerors. So we see sort of a loss of native culture in areas that are sort of settled by the more centralized Bantu people. Now, it's easy to sort of presuppose things like genocide as being the way in which the local native cultures are sort of edged out, but undoubtedly that had to have happened to a certain extent, especially given the sheer quantity of time that we're talking about. But a lot of times culture gets suppressed, not necessarily because of, deliberate exclusion. Sometimes it gets suppressed just by weight of numbers. So we know that with, centralized governments, you usually have agrarian societies. Lots of the tribes and groups in southern Africa and Eastern Africa, they're more like hunter-gatherer groups. And so we know that hunter-gatherer groups have to keep their population quite small. So, it's sort of like imagining if you are metal fans and there's 10 of you, and then 90 Taylor Swift fans come and start to intrude on your friend group. That doesn't mean that metal is somehow popular overnight. It just means that you're suddenly overwhelmed by the sheer number of Taylor Swift fans. Language is kind of like that. And before you know it, it's hard to find people that listen to metal like you. And so there's a lot of pressure to listen to Taylor Swift. I mean, learn different languages. Like, for example, adopting Swahili instead of the native or the original Bantu language. And of course, replacing the native languages in the areas settled by these Bantu settlers. So one thing that we've talked about again and again, sorry, I'm beating a dead horse, is of course the fact that Islam spreads primarily through trade routes. Where you see trade in Africa, you generally see the spread of Islam. So what that also means is that if you see the existence of Islam in a part of Africa, you're also going to see the existence of trade that connects it to not only the broader Islamic world, but even just the broader world. Where you don't see Islam, I'm not going to say you see total isolation, but you're going to see less connection to the broader Islamic world and also the broader global economy. We also tend to spend a lot of time focusing on Islamic Africa because remember, history is the study of the written word, and Islam brings with it some degree of literacy because it brings the Quran and basically, a written language. A lot of Southern and Central Africa is pre-literate. Many of the societies there don't have written languages, and if they're mostly hunter-gatherers, as many of them are, remember that literacy is something, or a written language is not really something that you see in most societies until the advent of agriculture and the demands placed upon society by agriculture. Now, we've already talked about the impact that Islam has on the Sudanic states and, of course, on states like, or areas like Western Africa with the Songhai, Mali, Ghana, etc. It's a big freaking deal. And also, that area of Africa impacts the broader Islamic world. I'm looking at you, Mansa Musa, with your hyperinflation. Bad Mansa Musa. Anyway, so but we've already kind of talked about why Islam is so important in that part of Africa. We're going to shift gears and talk about parts of Africa where you see the sustainment of, let's say, traditional African religions, and an area of Africa that is Christian, which is, going to be yet another exception. So first, let's tackle Central Africa, or an area of Africa without Islam. Why, you may ask, does it not have Islam? This is why. And of course, this is a picture of what the modern day Congo looks like. So yeah, just imagine hiking through that. So yeah, Central Africa is heavily forested, lots of jungle, lots of rivers that are not as navigable. And so you don't see the same connection with trade routes. So this is sort of what we would call terra nullius, unknown territory. And so this is an area where, again, it's mostly hunter-gatherers. You see herders, farmers. You see a population that is very skilled with metallurgy, possibly as a result of the sort of the Bantu migrations. And eventually you do see the emergence of states forming, which replace the kinship groups that sort of dominate these early societies. So let's talk about Zimbabwe. If people know anything about Zimbabwe, which is a Southern and Central African country, it usually has something to do with former President Robert Mugabe, or its, shall we say, unique currency situation. And yes, you read that right. This is a $100 trillion note issued by the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. So, inflation has kind of been a fixture of life in Zimbabwe, which is kind of ironic because hundreds of years ago, during the 14th century, Great Zimbabwe was an incredibly wealthy country that had an economy that was that basically revolved around gold. In the local dialect of Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe basically means house. And so the kingdom of Great Zimbabwe means the kingdom of basically the Great House. And actually, the kingdom of Great Zimbabwe had a double-walled stone structure known as the Great Enclosure. And so, yes, like the Great House literally had a great house. So one of the reasons that you had something like a Swahili coast that was able to trade with neighbors is because right nearby you had Great Zimbabwe, which basically traded with city-states along the Swahili coast for gold and other resources. Now, inhabitants of this area were not Muslim, as we've sort of talked about. That doesn't mean, however, that they were completely isolated from trade. So in Great Zimbabwe, we actually have evidence of glass from Arabia, pottery from Persia, and actually we have traces of porcelain from China. And these were all sort of luxury goods, which gives us a relative idea for how wealthy Great Zimbabwe was. Um, However, Great Zimbabwe declined, and we're not exactly sure why it declined. We think that climate change maybe has something to do with it, even though Great Zimbabwe had a highly advanced economy that revolved around metallurgy, knowing how to basically manufacture items that had both gold and silver. It's still an agrarian economy, and so, of course, climate change poses a substantial danger for any agrarian society. So what happens is that Great Zimbabwe is eventually abandoned by its population. Now, when Europeans actually visit and discover Great Zimbabwe in the 16th to 19th centuries, they're apparently so amazed at the level of sophistication of Great Zimbabwe that they assume that it had to be an Arab colony, because by that point you have the development of the slave trade and the racism that goes along with that, and so there's that idea of, African inferiority that sort of tarnishes and warps, what is something that is, it's something that's in plain sight. Okay, now we're going to shift gears from a nation state that basically, or kingdom that basically disappears, to one of the oldest continually existing nation states in human history, and that is, of course, Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia goes through a variety of sort of reinventions, but it exists probably as early as the 10th century BCE under a different name, a name that I don't know how to pronounce, but basically the Kingdom of DM apostrophe T, I believe. But the Ethiopia that we're talking about in its current form is the Kingdom of Axum. And the Kingdom of Axum actually had some fairly extensive trade relations with the Roman Empire, because remember, the Roman Empire basically controls all of North Africa, including Egypt. Ethiopia, they basically all the countries in that region, including like Abyssinia, Eritrea, Sudan, they're all intimately connected with Egypt and its economy. It's probably one of the first non-Sahara areas of Africa that's actually connected to global trade. Because remember that you don't really see trade emerge in Western Africa until the spread of Islam into that area, starting around the 6th or 7th century CE. With Ethiopia, one, it's not dominated by the Sahara Desert. It's an ancient agrarian society that's had long-standing, trade ties with not only Egypt, but like the entire region. So it actually gets exposed to religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam pretty early on. So you even get Silk Road trade, Trans-Saharan trade, like Ethiopia is a significant jumping off point. So what's interesting about Ethiopia is that Ethiopia, in a lot of ways, is a time capsule for many of the world's religions. So the variant of Judaism and Christianity, and eventually Islam, that arrives there preserves actually some of the older customs of those religions. And also you see sort of Ethiopian modifications to those religions. And Ethiopia is very proud of its independence. It becomes famous in the 20th century, spoiler, because it has a very charismatic king by the name of Haile Selassie, who manages to defeat an Italian invasion. Actually, Ethiopia is attacked twice by the Italians. The first time they win. The second time, they sort of are winning, and then the Italians are forced to use chemical weapons in order to win. Almost like, Italy is ruled by a fascist dictator at that point, and they don't mind breaking the rules to win. Looking at you, Mussolini. So, Ethiopia, like I said, has a very proud history of being independent, and that extends not only to politics but also religion. So, I'm going to speak specifically about Christianity because Ethiopia is actually considered one of the oldest Christian nations in world history. The main religion of the Ethiopian elite has been Christianity. And by the 12th century, we can say that Christianity is kind of practiced by the majority of the population, or at least the majority of the elite of Ethiopia. But the Christianity that you see is very different. Like we said, it's the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which doesn't necessarily connect with the broader Eastern Orthodox Church that is so intimately connected with Byzantium. It's really its own thing. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has its own Bible, and that Bible actually recognizes the a lot of books of the Bible that did not make it into the biblical canon that you see in Western or even Eastern Europe. So, for example, the Book of Enoch, that talks a great deal about angels and what the kingdom of heaven is like, talks about seeing the face of God. That's not considered canon in Western Christianity or Eastern Christianity, but it is adopted by the Eastern Orthodox Church. It might seem as if Africa is dominated by these religions that don't even originate there. Eventually, the majority of the African continent is dominated by mostly Islam, especially if you look at population, but also Christianity plays an outsized role as well. And eventually, Christianity will continue to spread throughout throughout this time period, and especially when we get into the sort of 19th century and the spread of Christianity because of European imperialism, you'll see the emergence, or let's say the greater spread of Christianity there. So, with all that being said, keep in mind that in all the areas, in all the places that we've talked about, whether it's Christian or whether it's Islamic, African peoples transform these admittedly foreign religions into their own sort of native variants. We saw that with the empires of Mali, the Songhai. We talked about that with Ethiopia. And even the Swahili coast, with its dependency on Arabic trade, practices its own sort of unique variant of Islam. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have different denominations, though in the course of Ethiopia, or in the case of Ethiopia, that's definitely true. It just means that syncretism is syncretism. And foreign religions get absorbed, but in the process, they also have to change as well. So that is the end of our discussion of sub-Saharan Africa. Speaking of the Orthodox world, next time we'll turn our attention once again back to Rome.